Africa, including Egyptian and Levantine, and broadly Arab, Egyptian, and Levantine. They also were able to show that I have ancestry from Tripoli, Libya, which is where both of my great-grandparents on my maternal side are from. They also showed that I had Southern European ancestry, which makes sense as my family on my mother's side is Sephardic and have roots in Spain and Portugal. So first I'm going to talk about my paternal ancestry, and I'm going to start with my paternal grandfather's side, the Lamports and the Lassers. So my father is Robert Lamport, and my grandfather on my father's side was Edward Lamport. So I'm going to speak about his parents. The Lamports. So my grandpa Edward's parents were Benjamin Lamport and Hannah Lasser. Benjamin Lamport was born in 1903 in Lithuania/Russia, as the borders changed a lot back then. His parents were Isaac Lamport and Dina Lamport. Isaac Lamport was born in 1860 and Dina was born in 1868. My grandpa Edward's Hebrew name is actually Yitzchak, which was named after his grandfather Isaac. Isaac's death certificate states that he was from Russia, was a rabbi, and his parents' names were Solomon and Esther Lamport. He arrived in America in 1915 and settled in Brooklyn, New York, and later moved to the Bronx. He was a spotter and worked in a cleaning store. My father tells the story that there wasn't a stain that Grandpa Benjamin couldn't get out. The Lassers. So Hannah Lasser, my great-grandmother, arrived in New York from Austria in 1913 with her mother Esther Lasser and her father Louis Lasser, and her 4 other siblings. Louis Lasser was a polisher of silverware at a brass factory. Louis's parents were Osius Lasser and Frida Tykes. Osius's first trip to America was in the early 1890s, and he came back to Poland and said, "The streets are paved with gold, we must go." However, Frida did not want to move as her whole family was in Poland, so they got divorced, and Osius moved to America in 1892. Years later, Frida Tykes and her children ended up moving to America also. Here is a certificate of my great-grandfather Benjamin Lamport and my great-grandmother Hannah Lasser's marriage. And above is a registration card for the military from Benjamin Lamport. I'm going to talk about my paternal grandmother's side, the Wassermans and the Muellers. The Muellers were my grandmother Ethel Wasserman's mother's side of the family. So Ethel Wasserman was born in 1937 in the Bronx, New York, to Rose Mueller and Abraham Wasserman. Both Rose and Abraham were from the town of Przemysl, Poland. Rose Mueller was one of 5 children born to Chaim Jacob Mueller and Ethla Rubenfeld. Chaim Jacob Mueller was a milkman in Przemysl. And here is a picture of Rose Mueller's trip to the United States. And here are pictures. My great-grandma Rose is in the middle with her 2 parents on either side and 3 of her brothers. And the picture next to it is my grandmother Rose and my grandpa Abe, both great, on the right, and in the middle is her father, Grandma Rose's father. So the Wassermans were Abraham Wasserman, who was born in 1907, or Grandpa Abe, who was born in Przemysl, Poland. He was the eldest son, and his father died when he was very young. When they were young, he lived on a farm with horses and a vineyard. They were considered quite well-to-do. However, in World War I, the Cossacks took them from their homes and put them on a train and took them to a Russian jail to be prisoners of war. Eventually, they were taken out as the Russian soldiers realized that they did not need them as prisoners of war anymore. So he went back to Poland and he went to Polish school as well as yeshiva. At age 13, he started an electrician apprenticeship as he needed to support his family. And then in 1934, he married Rose Mueller and he came to America in 1935. They lived in the Bronx and went on to have my grandma Ethel and her brother Jack. My grandma Ethel and Grandpa Edward got married in 1957. My grandfather was an artist, Here are two paintings that we have in our house of his, but as a profession, he worked in advertising in New York in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and he actually had some pretty big clients that he did work for, such as Dove, Revlon, Cartier, many others. And my grandma Ethel was on the board of many nonprofit organizations, on the board of many hospitals, and was very active in her community. Here is also a picture of my Aunt Holly and my father, Robert. My Aunt Holly is a buyer for Bloomingdale's, and my father is a gastroenterologist. Now I'm going to talk about my maternal ancestry, the Genealogy and Reginiano side of the family. My grandfather, Aaron Genealogy, was born in Israel in 1939. He is the second of 7 children of Hannah and Shaul Genealogy. Hannah and Shaul were born in Tripolitania, an area of Libya. Hannah's parents were Graziana Chaizi and Chaim Miranji. Shaul's parents were Rachel or Rachel Kish and Chaim Genealogy. There are records of a Jewish population in the area that is now Libya since the Hellenistic period, but we think the Genealogy family arrived during the Spanish Inquisition when the community grew significantly. Genealogy is not a common last name in the Jewish community, but there is a record of a Yonah Genealogy, a biblical grammar scholar and physician who lived in 1990 to 1055 in Spain. He wrote the first recorded book of Hebrew grammar. My great-grandfather and grandfather both were very knowledgeable in Hebrew grammar. My great-grandfather Shaul believed in a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. Well before he married Hannah, he went to Israel to see the country and find out about living and working there. He was a tailor by profession and made suits for men, mostly Italian officers in Libya, and when the fascists took over, the officers told him that it was going to be bad for the Jews and they should leave. My great-grandmother's parents were not sure they wanted their daughter to marry him since they knew they would eventually immigrate, but they agreed after they saw how much she loved him. There was an incident a few years before Shaul and Hannah got married. A group of 3 Arab thugs showed up at a Jewish wedding, armed with knives, and said they will not allow the wedding to continue until they raped the bride. Some of the guests quickly sent for 3 young Jewish men who were known to not shy away from confrontations. A fight broke out, and one of the Arabs was stabbed and died. 2 of the Jewish men ran away, and one, Chaim, was caught and jailed. My great-grandfather Shaul, who was known and respected by both the Jewish and Muslim communities, paid bakshish, which was a bribe common in those days and that place, to the right people, and Chaim was released. Chaim later married my great-grandfather Shaul's younger sister and immigrated to Israel. Shortly after Shaul married my great-grandmother Hannah, he was approached by members of the police, whom he knew, and they showed him his own picture, saying, "This Jewish man is wanted for bribery. Let us know if you see him." He realized he didn't have much time, sold everything he could, converted his money to gold, which he hid in a double compartment in his suitcase, and immigrated earlier than planned. He made plans for his wife to follow him, and she did, with a stop for several months in Alexandria, Egypt, to give him time to find them a place to live. My great-grandmother Hannah married Shaul when she was 16 years old. Her father was a carpenter, and her father was a local doctor. He wanted to teach her about herbs, plants, and medicine, but she was too young and not interested, something she regretted later in life. Her parents had 7 children, but only 2 survived to adulthood, her and her older sister. My grandfather Aaron was born in the British Mandate in Israel. His father was a tailor, but since there wasn't a lot of work as a tailor, he opened a small shop selling school and office supplies in Tel Aviv, a new city at the time. To supplement the household income, his mother watched another family's child. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. The general feelings towards the British Mandate were not positive, but when he was in 2nd grade, he went on a field trip that involved taking the public bus. He accidentally got off at an earlier stop than the rest of the class. He was lost and scared, and a British police officer found him and helped him get home. He also gave him a chocolate bar, unheard of during that time, which he shared with his siblings. The first Reginiano in Tripoli was Baruch Reginiano. He was born around 1780-1790. Baruch came, with his entire extended family, from Gibraltar, which was British at the time, and he became the British consul in Derna, Libya. Because of this, his entire family, including my grandmother, received British citizenship. Baruch was married but did not have children. Since he didn't have any children, he built a very large house in Tripoli where all the extended family lived, and in 1836, he built the second story of the house as a synagogue, which he called Dar Baruch. Baruch's brother, Shaul Reginiano, had a son named David Reginiano, who would go on to have 11 children. The second born and eldest boy of those 11 children was my great-grandfather, Shaul Reginiano, or Saba, in Hebrew for grandfather, Shaul. His family was considered wealthy. Saba Shaul had a farm and a vineyard with a small restaurant where he would serve wine from the vineyard and some food. He also owned what would be the equivalent to a taxi service today, but with horses and carriages. Since they were Jews, however, they could not apply for government contracts for their businesses. When the fascists came to Tripoli before World War II, things were okay at first for the Jews. Then, around 1940, the race laws were enacted. They took the Reginiano men and their families to Italy. They let them pack bags, however, only their small hand luggage made it to Italy. On January 16, 1942, they made it to the port of Naples and were taken to Villa Oliveto in the Arezzo region of Tuscany. Villa Oliveto was used as an internment camp by the fascists and was planned to become a concentration camp. The Reginianos were taken because they were considered valuable Jews based on their British citizenship. They could be treated for prisoners of war. When they came to the villa, there were already prisoners there, but they welcomed my family. There was not a lot of space, as there was only one shower and 4 sinks for about 80 people. Many families had to stay in one room, and there was a report of a family of 15 that had to stay in one room with only 4 beds. The Cardinal of Florence came to visit Villa Oliveto and spoke to my Saba Shaul's brother and said to him, "You are the older sisters of Christianity, so please pray for this war to be over soon." The Cardinal then sent the Rabbi of Florence to Villa Oliveto, and they were able to supply them with kosher meat and matzah for Passover. When the Germans took over northern Italy, my family was moved from Villa Oliveto first to a jail in Florence, and then eventually all the way to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp, the same concentration camp where Anne Frank died. After 8 months in Bergen-Belsen, the Nazis did a prisoner exchange. They took my family to Spain, where they exchanged with the British, 5 Germans for every Jew. From Spain, they were taken to Portugal, then to Casablanca, to Algeria, and finally back to Tripoli, where they stayed for a few years. After 1948, they came to Israel on a boat. They first stayed in a refugee camp, but eventually were able to work and buy a 1-bedroom apartment for the whole family. Finally, my parents and sisters. My father attended medical school at the Sackler School of Medicine, which was an American program through the New York Board of Education. However, the classes were taught in Tel Aviv, Israel. At the same time, my mother was completing her civil service for Israel. In Israel, after high school and before college, you must either enroll in the military or do civil service. My mother completed this by working in a hospital called Bellinson. When my father was doing his rounds in medical school, some of his rounds were at Bellinson, and this is where my parents met in 1987. In 1989, they got married, and they moved to New York, where my father completed his residency, and my mother worked as well as got her college degree in economics and business. They later moved to Baltimore for my father's fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and my mother had my oldest sister, Gabrielle. Later, after his fellowship, they moved down to Florida, where I was born, and 9 years later, my little sister was born. Today, my eldest sister, Gabrielle, is 26, and she works for the Department of Defense in the Pentagon, supporting the Secretary of the Navy. My younger sister, Juliana, is a 6th grader and is turning 12 next week. My father is a gastroenterologist, and my mother is a business manager. And this is my family.